Hey guys, welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. And today I'm so excited to be talking to Dr. Deborah Offner. Did I pronounce your last name right?
You did.
So, psychologist Deborah Offner is the author of Educators as First Responders, A Teacher's Guide to Adolescent Development and Mental Health, and a school consultant. And what I love about your perspective is that you understand what goes on at schools with the teachers and with the administrators, and the parents don't get that perspective. Like we don't get to see what's
How
going
the
on.
sausage is made. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, here we are. We're like handing over our very most precious possessions, and we don't have the insight that you do. So first, let's start with the question. We hear in the news, we hear from our friends, we know about our own kids that kids are so stressed right now, and the mental health issues are so prevalent. If you're thinking about it from the kids' perspective, what are they so worried about?
So I think kids today are worried about basically everything. I think, this is the most anxious, the most perfectionistic, the most stressed generation to date, according to a lot of research and survey work that's been done in the past couple of years. I think there's a lot of things that they worry about in part because there's a trickle down from parents, not intentionally, not even consciously, but I think parents are more worried, and frankly, with good reason. There's a lot of financial stressors, economic uncertainty, the disruptions that came from COVID. And so when parents are worried about their jobs or perhaps struggling in their relationships or even with substance abuse issues, which certainly were on the rise among adults during the pandemic to date, those are the kinds of things that kids worry about. And kids do worry about their parents, I think, more than we recognize and more than they tell us. Because when I see kids in therapy, they will talk about concerns they have about their parents, either that they're overworking or that they're not feeling well or that the two parents aren't getting along with each other, things like that. Kids also worry a lot about their futures. And I think that also comes from parents and schools feeling the pressure, the uncertainty about whether kids are going to be able to, say, maintain the standard of living they've had if they're in a middle class or upper middle class family, or climb their way out of a difficult situation where there may be poverty or economic instability. So there's a lot of worry sort of floating around, plus peer relationships, school achievement, kind of the usual suspects are still very much in the forefront.
I was thinking this morning that when I spend too much time reading the news, I feel like the sky is falling. And I
Yes.
wonder if access to, you know, when we were kids, we knew about local things that happened to other people, but now
Right.
we know about everybody's local thing, and
Yeah.
it's overwhelming.
It really is. And I think the most prominent and, I guess to some extent self-evident examples are things like videos of police brutality. So for example, obviously when George Floyd was murdered, and other murders that have happened much more recently, where kids are seeing those videos, and it's terrifying. And particularly in cases of, unarmed Black citizens being murdered by police, Black kids are seeing that, and that looks like them or their brother or their father. And again, you might have heard about it and it would be terrifying to hear about, but seeing it, I find with kids, is a whole different ball of wax. And you're absolutely right. They have access to all kinds of news. Some of that is healthy and good, but a lot of it is quite disturbing.
Yeah, I mean it's too much. It's too much for my old brain to manage. Like
Yes.
I don't know how you would do that as a tween or a teen. Okay, so what are the biggest changes you've seen since, not that we're post COVID, but I don't know how else to call it,
Yeah.
post
Since
the
the height of
quarantine
COVID.
part. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, the two major changes, and everybody can see this in the press, is learning loss, and also I would call sort of delayed or stunted or disrupted social emotional development, especially in the areas of social skills, behavior, impulse control, the kinds of socialization that school gives kids. So for example, I work in a middle school program for 14-year-olds in Boston, and the kids that we get who have just finished 8th grade and then they come to us for a year before high school, normally are a pretty well-behaved crop. But last year, when they were coming out of COVID, and our kids are mostly in urban, sort of under-resourced school districts, so they missed a lot of school. It wasn't even necessarily hybrid. They were out of school for a long time. When they came to us at 14, they were behaving like seventh graders. They were rolling their eyes at teachers and not listening and being really rowdy. It's not that kids can't do that and be perfectly normal and fine, but our kids at 14 usually weren't doing that in the other cohorts. And so we see a lot of delay. And then, of course, there's just more stress on families. And again, that trickles down to kids and a lot of uncertainty. Is my school going to suddenly close? Is someone going to get COVID and then it's going to spread and then we're going to have to lock down again? And when you're coming of age in a moment when there's all this uncertainty and sudden, rapid, abrupt change, you come to almost expect it.
I wonder if we are looking to go back to prior, or if we have to just start today and say, this is how we move forward. Like there's no going back. It's only going forward.
I think it's the latter. Yeah, there is no going back. I mean, these kids are formed by this experience. I mean, some of them in really devastating ways, having lost people or having parents that became long-term unemployed or things like that. And other ones that have had, reasonably privileged and comfortable lives, even during the pandemic height and lockdown, are still affected. And there's no going back. You can't say what's normal, for a ninth grader this year, because they're not normal ninth graders the way that we used to know them.
Well, they are. They're just today's normal, right?
Exactly.
Like
they're the new normal.
Yeah,
right.
That's it. The new normal.
Yeah.
Do you see a difference in resilience? Like there was always this sense that not only did kids need it, but the kids had it, kind of, that they were resilient. Has that changed?
I think kids are still super resilient. What I see is just tremendous sort of bounce back. And, you have to understand, it's not like they went through childhood once and didn't have a pandemic and now they're going through it again and there's a pandemic and they're like, what's going on? This is just what happened for them. And so what I see is kids, for so many reasons, right? I mean, they're not biologically, anatomically, their brains aren't fully formed. They're still forming all kinds of new neuronal pathways and developing in a sort of plastic way that adults aren't. Like I think it's actually been a lot harder for adults to bounce back than for kids to bounce back. And development is a beautiful thing. I mean, it just pushes kids forward. And so I don't think they're less resilient. I just think they're more, in some ways, using the term sort of broadly and loosely, traumatized, than the kids a few years before them.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you're a parent, you have to be watching for like so many cues of like the trauma. Yes. And then you have to be compassionate about the loss, right? The learning loss, of the socializing loss. But then there's glimmers of hope that this is just their reality and they're figuring out how to deal with it. So it's kind of like holding all of that.
Yeah, right. Being sensitive, compassionate, and aware and sort of attentive, but also understanding that they push forward. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a question that it's so hard to answer this question, but we send our kids to school for so many hours a day, and bullying is this thing that typically happens at school. I mean, now it happens online also, but the bulk of the experience is happening at school. So as a parent, I'm kind of left like without any idea of how to navigate this. So do you have any suggestions for, first of all, what can parents do? And then how can parents kind of team up with the schools?
Yeah, so I think parents obviously need to be alert to bullying, primarily if your child is being targeted by another child or a group of children at school. Also, to be perfectly sort of fair, whether your child might be the one doing the bullying. I mean, I work with a family that just last week, the mother got a call from another parent saying, your son is kind of harassing my son, sending him mean texts, making mean comments. And the mother had her seventh grader's password to his iPad and went on. And she found, unfortunately, really awful text from this son of hers who seems perfectly reasonable. And, she was quite surprised. It's a pretty rotten moment to learn that about your child, but you do have to be, rather than just say, oh no, my son would never do that, goodbye. She did investigate, and sure enough, like he was being, pretty cruel. I think if you have a sense that your child's being mistreated, you want to be a little bit mindful of the distinction between the usual sorts of stuff that kids do to each other, whether it's insensitivity or exclusion or all the kind of friend drama and other things that happen, especially in middle school as well as high school. That versus actual bullying, where your child is being targeted and targeted repeatedly in a way that is clearly intended to cause harm. And we certainly saw a lot of this in the pandemic, especially with girls in middle school and high school with virtual bullying, right? So group chats on which kids were, maligning each other and things like that. And nobody had any sort of jurisdiction, it seemed, because kids weren't in school and their parents didn't know what to do. I think in times when school's open and working, your first step with your child is always to learn from them what's happening, to listen, to not let your panic or need to deal with it override your sort of calm attentiveness. Because if they're telling you this, they need to see that you're calm, that you're not judging them, and also that you're not going to jump to do something that could make things worse. So you don't want to jump to call the other kid's parents. You don't want to jump to call the school. Tell your kid, if you do feel you need to do something, let's talk about it. I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, and you tell me how this sounds, and let's work on it together. And I won't do anything until you and I have both sort of signed off.
I am so touched by that approach. I also know how hard that would be for me to do. So it's almost like maybe we need to write down the things you just said and practice them before it even happens, because it's so hard to see your kids suffering and not like get teary-eyed or be like, what? Just overreact.
Right. And you have to just remember that your kid is having the teary-eyed and the what and the sort of alarm reaction. And also, some kids can feel really ashamed. I've known of multiple situations where kids, including very young kids, haven't ever told their parents because not that they necessarily thought their parents would get mad or judge them. They might have thought that, often irrationally, but they're really ashamed of being in this situation. And so it's like, you don't want you're feeling bad to make them feel worse about themselves. And so it's really protective of them. You can go to your spouse or your best friend and, cry or talk or vent, but in the presence of your child, to really be calm and to view it as a partnership. Like, you kind of work for them. You're going to help them troubleshoot this and sort of manage their PR and, help them figure out. They may not want you to do anything. They may want some tips about how they can be different, or how they can, what should I say when he says this? Or, what should I do? Where should I go? Again, depending on the age of the kid, and the dynamics of the situation, but you're their partner and helper.
I love that. You work for them. You work for them.
Yeah, exactly. That's my general, awesome. Yes, the customer service model of parenting is my general approach. Yeah.
Well, that happens a lot without it being productive, but maybe this is a place where it's very productive.
Yeah, I think in this instance, you want to be really, really ginger and mindful. It's think about how hard it is for a kid who's in this situation to manage their emotions. Like, you don't want them managing yours.
Yeah, that's so helpful. So I want to do right by my kid. I'm going to negotiate with my kid because I just heard you and thought that was great advice. Can I count on the school to be a partner, and how does that work?
So it really depends. I think, all of us have had experiences where schools have not been partners, have not been responsive, et cetera. But I think there's ways to go about approaching and navigating the school. I mean, a school, as you pointed out, I've worked in a school for many, many years. And so I understand what goes on behind the scenes. There are some people that are going to be really effective, useful, compassionate responders, other people who aren't. It doesn't necessarily map onto a job title. It's more the person. One place to start is asking your child if there's any adult in the school that they've told or that they would be willing or interested in telling or having you talk to. Who do they trust? Who do they feel has their back? Who do they feel really looks out for kids? And you don't have to start with going to the principal or the dean of students or the school counselor. You can, but you may start with going to your child's trusted teacher or advisor or favorite coach. And then you can also use another adult in the school to get intel about who you should go to and how you should approach, let's say, the administration about such an issue. So there's ways to approach the school that I think can affect your experience of that institution.
It's great. So don't go to the obvious counselor because that might not help your kid. Go to
I
the
mean,
people that might.
yeah, you can go to the counselor if you feel that they seem like they have a good reputation, if your kid thinks they seem like a nice person. And a good counselor will often then connect you with the proper administrators, and they'll be keeping their eye on who they think is going to do the best job.
It's kind of like the more people you bring in, the more people are looking out for your kid, right? Like,
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
you really, I mean, most child issues in schools with any kind of mental health or well-being, you sort of need a team. I mean, that's the way things work best because different people have different ideas or different sensibilities, and it's good when adults can work together.
Cool. Okay, I read something that you wrote about parent the child you have.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's a trend among sort of contemporary parents to want to shape their children into almost what I see as a predetermined version of what they want their child to be. So whether that's they want their child to be a pianist, or they want their child to go to an Ivy League school, or they want their child to play Division I baseball, that parents often have ideas about what their kids should be before their kids are even born, and often soon after. And I think the approach to parenting that I really support and endorse is one where you get to know your child for who they are, and you are along for the ride as they evolve and pursue the things that are important to them. And even if the things they want to do don't appeal to you, they're a different, separate person. And you want to honor that by being patient and open-minded, rather than trying to fit them into a mold. Because what I find is when kids are squished into a mold by their parents, and many are, either the kid loses almost a sense of their soul because there's so much sort of model that their parent molded, or sometimes kids sort of crash and burn. They do everything for their parents, because of what their parents want. And then when they have to be more independent, for example, going off to college, they sort of lose their footing, and there can be really bad consequences. So I think that's just my personal philosophy. I mean, it's, it varies tremendously across cultures and other things. But that's my personal preference.
It's so hard because there's this kind of notion that you're given a piece of clay and you're supposed to mold it as a parent. And that's like an old-fashioned kind of approach to parenting. It really, it isn't about molding them. It's letting them kind of emerge, right?
I think, yeah, emerge is really the right word. I think that's exactly what it is. It doesn't mean that you don't model things or that you don't provide opportunities, but you don't want to sort of force your kid in. I mean, I'm using activities. That's a concrete example of molding. There's other ways that we mold our kids psychologically, but you don't want to be forcing your kids into activities because then they can't find their own intrinsic motivation. They do everything because they have to and not because they really care about it. And that's just not a good way to go through life.
Yeah. It can be disappointing. Like you dreamt of reading books next to each other on the couch and you don't have a reader, like it can be really disappointing.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. I think, yeah, parent, you can be disappointed that your kid is an X, Y, or Z. I mean, ideally you don't let them know that. But it's okay. I mean, that's a normal human reaction. Doesn't mean you're a bad parent. Doesn't mean you don't adore your kid, but you get on board. I mean, my daughter dances and, has danced her whole life and dances in college. I mean, I don't even know how to dance in any way, shape, or form, and never would have, but it's super cool and interesting, like, why not? I mean, that's who she is.
Yeah. There's so much pressure around academic performance, and I think tied to which college you're going to go to. Is that more intense now, or are we backing away from that?
Well, kind of both, but mostly the first. I mean, it's way more intense now. I think that, like a lot of parenting trends that we're talking about, they're driven by economic uncertainty. And so I think a lot of parents, and I'll start by talking about kind of, middle class, upper middle class parents who have a certain level of privilege in their lives, may have, they've been to college, they have professional jobs. they are not sure at all that their kids are going to be able to replicate the lifestyle that they've provided for them. And that's with good reason. I mean, the United States in particular, there's no social safety net. I mean, you don't get health insurance, you don't get childcare, all these things that you get in other nations where there's less pressure. Universities are free, in a lot of other countries. Everything costs and nothing is guaranteed. And that's more the case now than ever before. So there's those parents. And then there's lower income parents who, urgently don't want their kids to be struggling in the way they are with, they have to work 2 different jobs and, have trouble paying the rent. Those parents also want their kids to get opportunity. And so it's like everybody's vying for the same spots in the same very small group of academic institutions, for the most part, not everywhere. It's worse on the coast and, certain other parts of the country. But there is so much pressure, and kids, research shows, are more perfectionistic, more grade focused than ever before. So I've never seen so many kids than I have in the past few years crying over a B+. It's like, it's not good enough. And that's a problem because there's a lot of people who go to the most elite colleges who end up, some of them are delighted with it and have a great life, but many of them end up, unhappy or stressed, or they feel they're only valued for their achievements. And that doesn't actually, it's not just that it doesn't lead to a happy life, it doesn't lead to a successful life. So that's, I always try to tell parents, it's sort of like parent the kid you have, find the college that's going to make your kid whole, whatever that means. And being whole actually maps onto success.
Yeah, we talk about it all the time. There's over 4,000 colleges. There's a college in there for your kid, and it might not be the one you dreamt of before they were even born, right? Like it might not be your college.
Exactly.
Okay, let's end with your best piece of advice for parents of tweens and teens.
Fasten your seatbelts. And understand that you are not alone, that this sort of rocky ride and, this cohort of kids, that we're all, myself included, going through it or have gone through it. And also that we all have worries about our kids, and that kids are remarkably plastic and resilient, and often who someone is at 12 is really not who they're going to be at 30. And to try to sort of keep that in mind, I think it's really important to try to maintain perspective.
That's very hopeful. Thanks so much, Deborah Offner, for being here with us. And thanks for all the great advice.
Thank you for having me.